All right, welcome back. This is Unit 4, Part 2, Language and Cognition. We want to remember our desired learning outcomes. After completing language and cognition in toddlers parts 1 and 2 and 3, you will be able to explain the Piagetian concepts of schema, assimilation, and accommodation. List and describe the 6 sub-stages of sensory motor intelligence. We're going to go through all those today. Describe the characteristics of infant memory. That's a big one. Describe components and developmental progression of language. And identify and compare the theories of language. Let's remember that schema, assimilation, and accommodation are 3 of the heavy hitters in this content area that we're studying. Children develop their schemata or their schemas that are also, we can think of them as models through assimilation and accommodation. These 2 processes help them build conceptual models of the world. Models start to work together. And we remember that assimilation is fitting new information into an existing schema. So, it's a human's ability to take in new information and adapt it to our. Okay, when new data is presented to us through our senses, we can, through accommodation, change the model in order to accommodate those new data. So we can see the difference here. One is more rigid. Assimilation is a bit more rigid, and accommodation is a bit more expansive. Piaget also described a process of organization, which is where we combine existing schemes into new and more complex ones. As our model of the world begins to grow in complexity and size, by connecting different schemata together, we can grow and refine our knowledge structures. Let's talk about disequilibration in Piagetian thought. That's when we detect discrepancies or contradictions between the models that we are constructing and the experiences we are having in our interactions with the world. I don't know how clear that is to everyone, including myself, but it sort of has to do with when we notice exceptions to things. This comes up a lot in language. Children, young learners of language tend to try to be very regular about everything, and that's why we get what's called overgeneration, where there's a generalization of, for example, how to form the past tense in English. And since a lot of those are formed by adding ed to verbs, when irregular verbs come into play, young learners don't understand them right away. So you'll get forms like goed, daddy goed to work, like that kind of thing, instead of daddy went. Equilibration, on the other hand, is when we get frustrated from disequilibration and we readjust our actions and models so that they are in better alignment. Again, this is more akin to accommodation than assimilation. All right. That's about it for the review. Piaget proposed different stages of cognitive development, and the first one is called the sensory motor stage. As promised, we're going to talk about 6 different parts of that. Got 5 different sub-stages, and rather than hang on this slide, we'll go to each individual one. Sub-stage 1 is about reflexes. At this stage, newborns are learning about the world through the use of their reflexes, such as when sucking, reaching, and grasping. Eventually, the use of these reflexes becomes more deliberate and purposeful. So at first, it's just kind of moving around as much as we can, getting feedback from our environment. This hurts, this doesn't hurt, right? I can move this direction, I can't move that direction, that kind of thing. After a while of gathering these data again and again and again and again, amassing a lot of them in our young brains, we start to interact in different ways, interact in more informed ways with our environments. Sub-stage 2 is called primary circular reactions. We go through 3 stages of this. During the next 3 months, the infant begins to actively involve his or her own body in some sort of repeated activity. We've probably all seen this kind of thing where a young person will repeat a certain hand motion several times. This is in some ways like cooing, where a baby will repeat a syllable several times, like ga, 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 something like that. But we'll come back to that later. Substage 3 is secondary circular reactions, where the infant starts to interact with objects in the environment. At first, they interact with them accidentally, bumping into them and stuff like that. But then these contacts with objects are deliberate and become a repeated activity. So going from primary to secondary reactions, we see a bit more deliberate character to the actions of the child. Agency, that's the word I was looking for. Substage 4 is coordination of these secondary circular reactions. At this point, the infant combines these basic reflexes and simple behaviors and uses planning and coordination to achieve a specific goal. Okay, it makes me think of when an infant takes a doll that they don't want and kind of pushes it out of the crib if they're far enough along to do that. Actually, you don't even have to be able to stand to do that, do you? Just get up on your knees and push that thing over the side of the crib. And other simpler actions, moving a blanket off of yourself because it's too warm, things like that. Which would be a progression from simply just kicking until the blanket comes off of you and not seeing a connection between your own action and the change in your temperature. Substage 5 is about tertiary circular reactions. Tertiary means third, of course, third degree. This is the stage where the toddler is considered a little scientist and begins exploring the world in a trial and error manner using both motor skills and planning abilities. So intentionally gathering data from the world around them, right? And figuring out systematic ways to do so. Even though we're not able to articulate those things, at this age, we don't have language, we're pre-linguistic, but we do figure out strategies for getting information from the world that we need. Substage 6 is called the beginning of representational thought. The sensory motor period ends at this stage with the appearance of symbolic or representational thought. Toddler now has a basic understanding that objects can be used as symbols. Okay, so something can stand for something else. A letter might stand for a sound. A tiny picture of a tree might represent a tree, that kind of thing. This comes along with object permanence, where we are able to conceive of objects that aren't in our direct line of sight, right? When we know that there is a toy somewhere in the house, rather than being despondent because we can't see the toy and therefore it no longer exists, right? That's this stage of development. And what I was just talking about is referred to as object permanence. This is a critical milestone during the sensory motor period. It's when we are able to conceive of things, again, that are not in our direct line of sight as still existing. Object permanence is the understanding that even if something's out of sight, it still exists. We all have to develop this in order to develop representational thought. Right around the same time that we develop object permanence, we also begin to exhibit stranger anxiety, which is a fear of unfamiliar people. So this actually requires a lot of coordination. You have to be able to recognize facial templates or pick up on the sound that people make, the sound of the voice. We know that infants can do that almost from birth. And we'll talk about that in a moment. All right. Infantile amnesia. No, it doesn't mean forgetting about the kids. It's the reason why we can't remember things that happened when we were babies. Memory requires the ability to represent things, to mentally represent experience. So because we don't have language, a symbolic system that would allow us to do that, we can't arrange those memories in a way that they can be, in such a way that they can be recalled later on. Isn't that interesting? Older children and adults therefore experience infantile amnesia. Can't remember what happened before you're 3, sometimes 2.5 or 2. All right. Let's get into my favorite part. We'll be going over this now, and we'll finish it up in the next unit, the next lecture. Language development. Language is essentially the one thing that separates us from other animals. We are between 1% and 3% genetically distinct from a chimpanzee. So what is it that really differentiates us? They're much, much stronger. They're longer lived. They have a better diet, right? But we can talk. And because we can talk, we rule the world, essentially. All right, what is language? I know it's just a leading question. Nobody has a perfect answer for it. We know what language isn't, however, and so one way that we could talk about language is to say that it is a system of communication that uses symbols in a regular way to create meaning. I've spoken about epistemology before, the process of creating meaning that humans do in all things, in all of their pursuits. They're creating meaning all the time. But what about a system of communication that uses symbols in a regular way? If we look at the banner here that says language, I've got these Roman letters here, Roman derived letters that we all agree spell the word language in English, right? The word doesn't come from English, doesn't matter. We all look at the same symbols and get the same meaning if we understand the phonology and the orthography of English, the sound interactions and the spelling of English. So a writing system like this one is a regular systematized way to represent the sounds of speech. We all have to agree on it or it has no value, right? It's like money. We have to agree that money has value or it doesn't. Really, it doesn't. It's just paper, right? But we assign a value to it. So we assign values to certain sounds and no values to other sounds. And that's language. This is what babies do. They learn to discriminate between linguistic sounds and non-linguistic sounds. It's an incredible process that requires processing unimaginable amounts of data. But one thing that's wonderful is that if a young person is exposed to more than one language, they will learn to discriminate fewer sounds. In other words, they will learn to not see as many sounds as non-linguistic as a monolingual child would. There's several components of language. These are some of the big ones. Phonemes. We've probably all heard of phonetics and phonology and stuff like that, but phonemes are the minimal units of sound. I think of the word telephone, it means a sound that's broadcast across a distance, right? I've spelled phonemes here in the IPA, the International Phonetic Alphabet, that shows just the discrete sounds of an American pronunciation of this word. And the way that we spell things, especially in languages like English, French, some others, doesn't have a high correspondence to the way that we pronounce things, right? We have a lot of extra letters in English, right? Phonemes are the sounds unmasked. They are the sounds without that spelling getting in the way, which is the minimal units of sound. Morphemes are their companions, they're their counterparts in terms of meaning. They're minimal units of meaning. If you just look at the word morphemes, the letter S at the end of it lets an English speaker know that this is a plural noun, right? So even if I am not able to analyze or break down the rest of this word, probably few people could anyways, I'm able to recognize it right away. Oh, S, it's a plural, right? I don't necessarily think that to myself out loud each time I see an S, right? But we know that this tiny little symbol conveys a bit of meaning. What about semantics? Semantics has to do with the set of rules we use to obtain meaning from morphemes. Sometimes people will say that semantics is about meaning, or that everything is about meaning and everything is about semantics. But now we're moving more into a sort of conceptual side of linguistics, the study of language. Syntax, it can be defined this way and other ways. It's a set of rules of a language by which we construct sentences. Okay, so how do you form a grammatically well-formed sentence in English? Well, you have to have subject, then verb, then object, right? You can't break that rule. In Japanese, it's subject, object, verb, right? So as native speakers of these languages, we know these things without being able to necessarily articulate them, right? We know how to form a grammatically well-made sentence in our first languages. We don't ever need to, in general, unless you're an English teacher or a Japanese teacher, you don't need to unpack your knowledge of that and explain it to someone else. It's something that you learn implicitly, but you know when it's been violated, right? You know when it's wrong. You know when a sentence doesn't look right to you. In linguistics, the study of language syntax is the study of how words and morphemes combine to form larger units like phrases and sentences. Oops, went too far. All right, what about words? Lexemes, another word for words. The meaning of words is not fixed. It changes according to the context. You know, one of the worst sources for the meaning of words is a dictionary. Why is that true? Because the dictionary is obsolete almost as soon as it's published. Meanings change quickly, and usage changes quite quickly as well. So we can't publish. Human beings, even if we took everyone on the planet and got them to work on this, are not able to capture the essence of a language in use and write a prescriptive book that tells you how you should use this language. It's never happened in history. So perhaps someday, but until we understand language better, we need to be a bit flexible about it and understand that the meaning of words is not something that's assigned from some power on high. It's something that is flexible and changes. Didn't even need that slide in there at all. Cut. Learning new words. One thing that I want to get across is that language is a universally human capacity. There is no difference in the human capacity for language across cultures, across continents, across political lines, all of that kind of thing. The capacity for language is an equally human capability. So flowing from that is the fact that no language is better or worse than another language. It's not possible. If you look at the data, it's not possible for it to be so. A language that would be of poor quality wouldn't be a language. You have to be able to communicate absolutely everything you could ever possibly think of for something to be a language, right? And there hasn't been a language yet where you can't do that. So that's the threshold, you know. Has someone learned it? Then it's a language, right? Is it the first language you learned? Then it's a language. There's just no, there's no gradation. There's no better or worse. And that goes for varieties of language too. If we look at the United States, just within California, look at all the different types of English that are spoken here. And people have different feelings about them, but what they amount to is ideologies. They aren't based on any kind of study, any kind of data, nothing scientific. They're just based on how we feel. And it's very hard to step back from that and be objective when we've all been raised with feelings about our languages and our varieties of our languages. But from a scientific perspective, there is no difference whatsoever between my English and Texas English, right? New York English and UK English. There's no difference in quality whatsoever. We spoke last time about how an infant's senses are developed pretty well. Some of them are developed pretty well at birth. From birth, babies recognize their mother's voice, and they can also discriminate between the sounds of the languages spoken by their mothers and other languages. I wrote foreign languages, but I don't like to use that term. Babies also show preferences for faces that are moving in synchrony with audible language. We know this because of laboratory research that's been done, in one case by Blossom and Morgan, 2006, et cetera, et cetera. So we're constantly looking for symmetry. Human beings tend to find other humans that have symmetrical faces attractive. When you're watching a movie and the audio is kind of off, so it's a little slower than the characters' mouths are moving, you don't like it, makes you uncomfortable, it takes you out of the experience, right? The babies are the same way. When shown that kind of thing, a movie with the audio track a little bit off, they react negatively. Can newborns communicate? I'm sure anyone watching this would say yes, right? But they communicate extra-linguistically, that is outside of the use of language. So they use cries, they use movements, these kinds of things. They throw something they don't want or grasp at something they do want, this kind of thing. So it is communication, but without the aid of any kind of regularized, formalized system. That brings us to the end of part 2. We are going to come back for part 3 next time. I want to direct everyone to Canvas to please take the post-test now that you have watched this lecture, and I'll look forward to seeing you again next time. Thank you.